Osama, that you've made the right choice. Look, it's great to be back here in Lahore. I was here at the Lahore Lit Fest 4 years ago, and it's great to see how it has expanded, how the crowds have grown, and the program gets better and better. Look, I'm no stranger to Lahore. It's one of my favorite cities. I was a foreign correspondent in Delhi for several years and used to come here quite a lot to cover Pakistani politics, etc. There's always lots going on, as there is still today. What I'm going to do is briefly talk about the book and what it is about and perhaps what it's not about. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to be playing some of the extraordinary imagery that's associated with magic of India. So without further ado, let me start by explaining to you what the book is not about. It's not about godmen, it's not about witches or the occult. I don't speculate about Sachin Tendulkar's success at the crease after taking the advice of his Parsi astrologer and changing the number on his jersey to 33. And I don't deliberately set out to reveal any of the secrets of the magician's craft. And while my list of conjurers, tricksters, illusionists, jugglers, and cunning conmen is a long one, so too is the list of the more illustrious figures rubbing shoulders with these people that you would not expect to find, including Motilal Nehru, Madame Karma, who had a revolutionary cell in Paris bent on the overthrow of the British Raj, Subhash Chandra Bose, and a mysterious Indian potentate called Prince Ranjit of Baluchistan, who turned up in London in 1901, much to the consternation of the India office who'd never heard of him. And maybe we can talk about him a little bit later. There's references to Kautilya, who urged the use of sleight-of-hand artists as spies, and to the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, whose obsession with India's wonder workers interfered with the day-to-day running of the state to such an extent that a group of complainants wishing to report abuses of power by the governor of Bengal had to dress up as magicians to get his attention. The story of Indian magic is a long one. Some would say it is as long as the rope that the fakir throws into the air until its end disappears in the heavens. The Jataka tales, composed in the 6th century BCE, contain references to snake charmers, sword swallowers, and the great Indian mango tree trick. Indian fortune tellers were in great demand in ancient Rome. The Tang emperors of China employed Indian alchemists who peddled secret formulas that promised longevity and sexual prowess. And after watching the tricks of street magicians, the 6th century sage Samkara used their principles to explain the concept of Maya or illusion. During the Abbasid Caliphate, the booksellers of Baghdad sold Indian conjuring manuals translated into Arabic. Silk route travelers returned with stories of men who not only charmed snakes, but also sharks to protect the pearl divers of Ceylon. And the great adventurer Marco Polo wrote about Kashmiri wizards who could make idols speak, control the weather, and turn day into night and night into day. In the India Office records, I chanced across an unpublished manuscript by a European traveller from the 1930s who described with complete conviction a Himalayan wizard who could deatomize and reatomize solid objects hundreds of miles apart, a man who called himself Musafa and who lived in a railway colony near Sukur, who could empty a safe of its contents from more than a mile away. And at the jail in Madras, there was a sadhu who mystified warders by being found outside his locked cell every morning. In 1813, the enterprising captain of an Englishman docked on the Thames with a troupe of South Indian jugglers, and their appearance at Pall Mall would change the face of Western conjuring forever. Within a few decades, continental magicians were blackening their faces, donning turbans and silken robes, and adopting oxymoronic names such as the Fakir of Shiva, the Fakir of Ulu, the Fakir of Ava, and the Fakir of Jaipur, prompting one early 20th century writer to complain of the Fakir invasion, and I quote, "If there were any towns in India lucky enough to escape from these specialists, they must have been confined to Houdini's Chinese torture cell, probably the only place on earth where they would have been safe from confiscation." Western magicians travelling to India in the late 19th and early 20th centuries filled their memoirs with stories of encounters with Indian conjurers, proving their superiority by engaging in contests with street magicians, debunking their tricks and stealing those they could use in their shows back home. Perhaps the most famous magician in history, Harry Houdini, began his career at the Columbian Exhibition in Chicago in 1893, calling himself a Hindu fakir and performing two of the classics of Indian magic, the mango tree and needle and thread illusions. Thousands of magicians, acrobats, dancers and musicians from the subcontinent were recruited to the great world fairs of the 19th and early 20th century. And so closely was India associated with magic that in December 1899, London's Strand magazine declared in its typically unequivocal tone, "Ask the average Englishman for what India is most celebrated, and chances are 10 to 1 that he will ignore the glories of the Taj Mahal, the beneficence of British rule, even Mr. Kipling, and reply unhesitatingly in one word, jugglers." So that's the sort of story, and that was kind of the thing which I really wanted to do in the book, was to explain how India's jugglers, its magicians, achieved this accolade. So I'm, taking the story up until the beginning of the 20th century and what happened since. So that's it.
Thanks a lot, John. And well, one thing which he omitted to mention is that during sort of the research of this book, he picked up a few magical tricks. So what we also do during this presentation is the famous severing of the human body trick. And so we want 3 volunteers.
Yes, just one volunteer, please.
It mostly works.
It mostly works, yeah.
It did work in Jaipur, did it? No.
Yeah, look, no, actually in Bangalore, I had a magician come on stage with me. This was only 2 weeks ago. It was a very sort of heavy-hitting conference. My session was straight after the Indian Home Ministers, and the juggler, the street magician, decapitated his assistant on stage by putting a knife through his neck. Yeah, so we won't do that. Yeah, for a start, we need a blanket to clean up all the blood, so we'll dispense with that. Yeah, but yeah, there's some pretty amazing stuff, and Indian magic tends to be very gory as well.
I can imagine. Thank you for that introduction, and I guess the first obvious question is that you did talk about what's not in the book. And for some obscure reason, somebody approached me yesterday and said, "Will there be any witches?" And I said no, and seemed really disappointed, although there is a lot else. But what struck me amazing about this book is that you start off by talking about the role magic or the spectacular or the miraculous plays in religion. You talk about mythology, lore. You talk about when Islam comes and all that. And then you go all the way to what happened in the royal courts and what happens in everyday, street magic. So the canvas is very broad. But I guess the fundamental question is, why write the book? What motivates someone to dedicate such a lot of energy to write about magic?
Because, I see it as a parallel history of India, a cultural, social, political, economic, religious history of India told through its magic traditions. Okay. And it was no one had ever done it before. I had no idea what I was getting myself into when I started the book, because it was a lot broader than I could possibly have envisaged, because there was just so much there. But it was extraordinarily interesting. I mean, I love going through archives. I love uncovering stories. Time and time again, I came across these extraordinary characters, particularly colonial period onwards, There was a magician, a South Indian magician called Ramaswamy, who was his name was a corruption of Ramaswamy. He was the most famous Indian magician, one of the most famous magicians in the world in the early 19th century. And whenever I've given this talk in India, no one has ever heard of him. And the other thing I should add is I keep on talking about India. I'm actually talking about the subcontinent. Most of the book is historical up until partition. We can talk about magicians who came from Lahore, who were very famous. Gogia Pasha, another famous magician, came from Multan. So I'll just clarify that at the very beginning, that whenever I say India, 99% of the time I'm talking about the Indian subcontinent pre-partition, so I'm including Pakistan and what is now Bangladesh, etc., etc. But just getting back to your point, I mean, I'm a journalist by profession, and I love uncovering untold stories, particularly entertaining stories, or interesting stories, not for the sake of entertainment, but stories that kind of cast a light on a wider canvas. And the lives of these magicians, the means by which these magic traditions were transferred from east to west, is what fascinated me. These channels of communications and so on. It was just a fascinating thing.
Fair enough. So I guess to the uninitiated, there seems to be a distinction between when you talk about illusionism, magic. Jugglery seems to be something quite different, which requires physical prowess and dexterity. And I wouldn't say you lump them together, but there is an element of overlap when you talk about magic, because a lot of these people are jugglers, but some are doing sort of outright magic.
Yeah.
So I guess the question arises that how do you define magic? And I am going to ask you later about what you feel about the more sort of mysterious aspects of it, because it seems to me that a lot of what you're talking about is actually illusionism. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, look, magic is one of these, overused terms. I mean, the magical feeling that you have when you fall in love. The magic of a magical sunset. Newspaper headlines: Modi loses his magic after he lost the Rajasthan state elections. Was a headline that I picked up when I was there. But it is so. It's one of these. It's like love, isn't it? It's a term that sort of is very ill-defined. And depends very much on one's perspective. But the core of the book is entertainment magic, stage magic, and the definition that I come up with is the artful performance of impossible effects. So it's a very, it's a short definition, but it's all kind of all-encompassing. The other thing that you need to bear in mind is that a Western conjurer, Western illusionist, magician, whatever you want to call him, will never claim that what he or she does is anything other than trickery, okay? No matter how impossible the effect, okay? I mean, the more impossible, the better the magician he or she is. In South Asia, on the subcontinent, those distinctions have always been blurred, because a holy man, whether he's a pir or he's a yogi or sadhu, will use a bit of sleight of hand in order to try and convince his followers that that what he's doing comes from some spiritual powers or something supernatural. And the same way, the street magician will invoke the god Indra, the god of magic, for instance, if he's a Hindu. Even if he's a Muslim, he'll still invoke the god Indra if the audience that he's performing before happens to be Muslim. And other sort of bits of mythology and so on, religious tropes into his act. So it's this blurring that you get in the East, to put it very broadly, that you don't get in the West.
So that's very interesting, because you talk about a certain kind of conflation and blurring between the two. And I'm reminded of this apocryphal story associated with the patron saint of Lahore, Data Ganj Bakhsh, in which, of course, he stands for the advent of Islam in this part of the world, and there are these Hindu deities or adherents of the same who are opposed to it. So how these tales, which are considered to be sacred tales, emerge of Ali Hajweri or Data Ganj Bakhsh, the saint, the Muslim saint, having these miraculous powers, competing at that magical level with the Hindus. So,
yes, that's right. Yes, there are stories of that.
So what struck me also here was the fact that there is there are no boundaries really to speak culturally or religiously speaking when you
No.
look at South Asia over the last couple of 100 years, and you specifically mention the concept of jinns and the more esoteric aspects of Sufism. So I was just wondering, because you do dwell on it, but not as much because you have other things to talk about. What were some of the interesting sort of observations you had when you looked at that?
Yeah, look, I included jinns because, the jinns in a way, being, these sort of semi-human figures or figures, that made out of smoke and so on that appear in the Quran, smokeless fire. They followed, if you can put it that way, in the footsteps of Arab traders, invaders, and so on. And even Hindus in India these days will believe in jinns. The concept of jinns is very much still a part of Muslim cultures in India, particularly in places like Hyderabad, where I gave a talk in an old Pyga palace that the owner of which was said, with all total conviction, that it was haunted by jinns. So I wanted to bring this in, but also, as you mentioned, Sufi mystics, when they came to India, there are numerous stories of them engaging in contests with Hindu yogis to show whose magic was more powerful. One would levitate up to a certain level, but the Sufi mystic would not only levitate, but just sort of fly off in all directions and cover the four corners of heaven in a matter of seconds, leaving the Hindu yogi, sort of sitting there in only a couple of feet above the air, looking rather defeated. So this was you can find numerous references to these sort of contests. In early works.
So I was looking at the images, and if you think about it, and I'm sure there are several people here who perhaps made the same connection, a lot of them seem to be images right out of, Edward Said's notion of Orientalism, right? So these are the kind of images which were used, and what Said wrote about in terms of this depiction of India as the sensual, exotic. And I was wondering, much as you're doing a history and a critical history of this very interesting subject, was there sort of any anxiety that you are sort of playing into this Orientalist notion? Who writes about naked fakirs in the 21st century?
I know. Yeah, I was accused of this at the National College of Arts just the other day. In fact, a student walked out because she thought I belonged to the wrong century. Because you can't actually, I'm presenting this imagery because that was the imagery that was associated, that came to be associated with Indian magic. I present the way that Indian magic was described in the accounts of colonial officials, of missionaries and travelers, newspaper reporters who came to India. And they, because I wanted to show just how closely India and magic were associated with this Orientalist image, became synonymous with this Orientalist image of India. But what I found was interesting was that it was the Orientalization of Orientalism, because some of these Western magicians who performed dressed up as Indians took this process that step further. I think it's a very valid, by becoming more Indian than the Indians, if you like. They became so good at portraying Indians that their audiences were convinced that they were Indians, or other. There was an American magician who played a Chinaman who was he did the act so well that the real Chinese magician, who was his actual competitor at the time, everybody thought that he was the fake and the American was the real one. So it's this Orientalization of Orientalism that was also fascinating. And look, maybe it's a bit anachronistic to be talking about this, but I think it's a really valid field of research, because you can see just the impact, the effect that these Orientalist tropes had on Western popular culture. Yeah.
No, I think that's a very interesting facet of the book which I want to get to, because there is a lot of cultural migration both ways, and there's a lot of assimilation as well as aping both ways. And if anything, the ascendant image, at least that of the magician, is the Indian image, right? And one could say that is further exoticization of the exotic, but still that's happening. But let's talk a little bit about Jahangir, Emperor Jahangir, and and I have a bit of a complaint, because you haven't painted him in a very rosy manner, but I'm sure you have good reason to. I've always thought that we have been rather unfair to Jahangir, depicting him as this opium eater who has no time for anything else. I have some arguments in his favor. I mean, he's the ultimate romantic when it comes to the royals. I mean, both Anarkali and Noor Jahan, for one emperor, is not bad. He is somebody who has this encyclopedic knowledge and sort of verve for accumulating information on botany, on everything. So he's somebody who's also seeking spirituality. So he engages with all kinds of faiths. And so
As did Akbar. Yeah.
yes, as did Akbar, and so in the same tradition. So, Jahangir appears in my novel, and actually in a much more rosy sort of fashion. But the question was that, so you show him to be someone who's self-indulgent, who gets taken in by magicians, and I guess connected to that is the fact that one of the most sort of persuasive, real sort of eyewitness accounts of some of these magical tricks, which I read, and courtesy your book, and Tuske Jahangiri, is from Jahangir.
Yeah.
And so I wonder what you really make of it, because the authenticity of I mean, he's put it down in his memoirs. Right?
Yep.
And so people must have checked and double-checked, not that they had any editorial power.
Yeah, no, that's right.
So what do you make of this narrative when he talks about Indian magic, and why do you not like him?
Oh, no, I don't dislike him. No, not at all. I'm sorry if I give that impression.
That's
but no, the passage in the book that Osama refers to is what really opens the book, because in his memoir, Jahangir describes a troop of 7 Bengali jugglers who come to his court. And over the course of several days, they perform 28 magic tricks. And it would have taken several days, because some of them are very sort of long and complicated. There's a version of the Indian rope trick. There's they start off by one of Jahangir's officials asking the chief juggler to plant, to make a tree grow. So the juggler plants not one seed, but about a dozen seeds, and from each of these seeds grows a different tree. And then these trees, bear fruit, then the leaves turn these autumnal tints, and then they sink back into the ground.
And they taste the fruit.
And they taste the fruit, yeah. So this is, and then there's, I don't describe all of the 28 tricks, but I do describe most of them. And then I go on to describe a performance of Indian jugglers that I saw while I was researching the book. Somebody assembled a troupe of jugglers for me in Delhi. And almost all of the tricks that they performed, you could trace their provenance back to this account of Jahangir's. So instead of an orchard of trees, one juggler made a mango tree grow out of nothing. Jahangir describes a magician who came with a large book that had with pages of the purest white. Every time he opened the book, the pages would change. The first time they were red in colour, speckled with gold. The second time there was lettering on them. The third time there was pictures of animals. The fourth time pictures of people, and so on. The juggler that I saw in Delhi, he had a book. Every time he flipped through the pages, the image on those pages would change. Okay, exactly the same sort of thing. Jahangir describes a juggler who pulled a serpent out of his mouth, and then another juggler pulled another 6 out of his mouth, each of them this long. I mean, some of this stuff is obviously, gets a little bit exaggerated. I don't for a moment see. But look, I mean, the trick of pulling a snake out of the mouth is a common one in India. The magicians that I saw in Delhi, instead of regurgitating snakes, they regurgitated rusty nails, screws and balls from their mouth, seemingly out of nowhere. So that's what I wanted to do, was to show that the provenance of the tricks that Indian magicians are still doing today go back not just to the time of Jahangir, but even further. As I said, the Jataka tales contain a description of this mango tree trick.
So it's not just opium.
No.
There's something going on.
Oh, there was something going on. Yeah. There was something going on. Certainly there was a degree of exaggeration in the account, but that's to be expected.
So one of the most fascinating tricks, which remains a mystery, I'm sure lots of theories propounded, and I'm sure almost everyone here must have heard of it, is the great Indian rope trick. So you take this seemingly completely supple rope, which looks like a rope, feels like a rope, throw it up and it becomes steady and erect, and then a little boy goes up, and then there are all kinds of things which can happen,
Yeah.
you know, limbs fall down, and the reassembly of
Yes.
the human body and all that. So I was closely reading this text to find out where you give the secret away, which I'm not going to tell the readers whether you do or you don't, but it struck me, you know, this particular trick, there are others of course, but this seems to be the quintessential trick associated with exotic India. And I wonder, I mean, it's quite fascinating because some of the theories propounded as to how it is actually done were also debunked.
Yes.
A lot of the people make actual physical examination of the rope before it's actually
Yes.
done.
Yes.
So it remains an enigma for me, and I wonder what you make of it.
Well, okay, so the rope trick, the provenance of the rope trick also goes back a very long time. And when you think of it, when you think of stories like Jack and the Beanstalk, Jacob's Ladder, you know, in shamanistic societies, it's trope of the cord somehow linking heaven and earth. It's a common trope that's found in different societies across the world at different times. In India, there were numerous references to it, going back over the millennia. But the story really got going in about 1890, and it was thanks to a piece of fake news that went viral.
Even then.
Even then, yeah. I imagine what would have happened if it was now, but one shudders to think. But so there was an article in the Chicago Tribune which described a couple of American reporters going to India and witnessing a performance by a troupe of jugglers. They did the mango tree trick, they did the basket trick, and then they did the rope trick. But one of the reporters had his Kodak ready, and another one was an artist who sketched what was there. The magician made the rope rise into the air. Boy climbs up, disappears into the sky. His dismembered limbs come raining down, and they're reassembled by the magician. This is the standard version of the rope trick. Now, what happened was when they developed the film, there was nothing there. There was no rope, there was no boy, there was no magician. So, you know, the conclusion that they reached was that it was hypnotism. The fact was that this was a piece of fake news that the paper published in order to sell more newspapers. I thought, wow, this is a great story. You know, India's exotic. You know, yeah, they'd obviously heard of the rope trick, but by the time they issued the retraction, which was about 4 months later, the story had gone viral, and you know, it had been republished in newspapers in America, translated into different languages in Europe. And suddenly, all these people came out of the woodwork and they said, no, it's not hypnotism. We've seen this trick performed in real life in India. We were not hypnotized. There was a whole bunch of us. You can't hypnotize more than one person at a time. So therefore, it is real. And then you had all these other people saying, no, it's just physically impossible. It would defy the laws of nature. For a rope to rise in the air strong enough for a boy to climb up and disappear and do all that sort of stuff is absolutely impossible. The thing was that, you know, if it could be proven that the rope trick existed, it would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt not only that Indian magicians were better than their Western counterparts, and there was a lot of East-West rivalry at this time, but that, you know, Indian magic was something really special that did, you know, that there was a supernatural occult element to it that meant that a magician had these extra powers that Western magicians didn't. So there was a lot of debunking and controversy over the trick, and I do explain how Western magicians appropriated this trick. Can we stop there? No, actually, go back one more. No, other way.
दूसरी तरफ, पीछे.
Piche. Ecord. Yeah, bus, stop. Okay. Now, in 1934, the Magic Circle, which was the most prestigious magic society in the world in London, they assembled a group of experts to cut the rope trick down to size once and for all, because it was just like getting out of control, okay? And we've got to reassert ourselves. We Western magicians are better than our, primitive in quote marks, Eastern counterparts. So they posted a reward of 500 guineas to the first magician who could do the trick out in the open without any props. This is Karachi, who is performing the trick on the outskirts of London in 1934, and this feat was captured by a BBC film crew. Okay? His real name was Arthur Claude Darby. He was a fitter and turner from Plymouth and a gypsy. But he called himself Karachi, and his son, Qaida, whose real name was Cyril, climbed up a rope. As you can see, it's just a bit of coiled rope, and you can see in the film footage how he's, showing the rope to the people there, and they're examining it, and there's nothing inside it. But he didn't get the reward because his son didn't disappear when he reached the top. But despite the best efforts of the world's leading magical society to bury this trick once and for all, they didn't succeed because people saw that, and the images were republished in newspapers and so on, and the controversy sort of went on.
I see.
Yeah.
So a couple of other, because you describe a lot of characters. There are lots of fascinating characters in your book, and the magician Khuda Bakhsh.
Yes.
And the fact that he could get blindfolded and still read text, the X-ray eyes.
Yeah.
And then, of course, that very sort of high publicity demonstration of walking on the fire, which happened in England.
Yeah.
And so, is this mind over matter? Because hypnotism is one thing, there are mechanical explanations.
Is another, yeah. So there was a Kashmiri magician called Khuda Bakhsh, and he was born in around the turn of the century. But he went to the West around about the same time as Karachi was doing this sort of stuff. His two signature tricks were the X-ray eyes routine, and this was done under medically supervised conditions, where doctors put dough over his eyes, balls of dough, lumps of dough, and then bandaged his face numerous times. Only his nostrils were left uncovered, otherwise he would have suffocated. And he could still read from a book. Somebody had pulled off a bookshelf totally at random, behind him, and, read the pages, and nobody could work out how he did it, even his fellow magicians. His other signature trick was walking on hot coals. So he actually did the first fire walk in England. And again, it was scientifically supervised. They measured the temperature of the fire pit. It was hot enough to melt steel. They measured the temperature of his feet before and after the walk. They checked to see if they were calloused, to see if there was anything smeared upon them. And he managed to walk across this fire pit, not once, but twice, but 3 or 4 times. And then, some other guy, thought, oh, well, if he can do it, I can do it too. Took one step, and sort of, an Englishman sort of jumped in the air and, had to be treated for blisters. So there was, again, this was at a time, mid-1930s, when, this kind of contest between East and West over whose magic was superior had really reached its height. Sure. Not only was the rope trick controversy at its height, but then along comes Khuda Bakhsh, who, they think that, okay, we've proven once and for all that our magic is better, and then he comes along and does a fire walk. And they just can't work out how he's done it, because his feet don't get burnt, the temperature doesn't rise, it's filmed again, it's done under scientifically supervised conditions, they measure the temperature and all of that. Again, it's this was making headlines around the world. This thing, it was in India, all across the world. It was like the story of the day. And look, one theory was that it was mind over matter. Okay. The other theory was that, and there was a time, that was the second attempt. He actually did it once, but he didn't do it again. And again, he said that it was. Somebody had tampered with the fire, and his concentration, faith was gone. Yeah.
Which I thought was very enigmatic.
Yeah.
So there's obviously something mental going on.
There's something mental going on. Yeah.
So moving on to what you've referred to earlier as well, I think another thing which I did not realize was the extent of interface on the basis of magic between East and West. So starts off in a slightly more exploitative manner, when a lot of jugglers and people are taken almost as indentured laborers, and a lot of them sort of came back without having made any money and living in a very sort of difficult situation. But then you have the emergence of these very entrepreneurial Indian magicians who develop this entire following and brand. And then you have a reversal. You have a lot of Western magicians. And some of them go back to India, as you said, in a reverse migration. And then there's a lot of competition. So do sort of describe this a bit more. It's a fascinating thing.
Yeah, look, it is. There's a couple of aspects to that question. One is, there was a trade in show people. In the 19th, particularly second half of the 19th century, you had these huge international exhibitions and expositions, and obviously, people weren't able to travel to these exotic lands, so they brought these exotic lands to them. So they recreated whole Indian towns, cities, palaces, and all this sort of stuff, and they stocked them with magicians, musicians, dancers. You could ride a camel, you could buy curry, you could get chai, you could do all these sorts of things, you could shop for things and all that. And there was thousands and thousands of these show people were recruited. Many of them were magicians, and more often than not, once they were recruited by these rather shady entrepreneurs, impresarios, made to sign contracts they didn't understand. Once they were, they'd outserved their usefulness, they were often dumped on the streets of London or Berlin or Brussels and other cities, and the India office had to step in and repatriate them. Interestingly enough, one of the people who did the recruiting, and I love telling the story in India, was Motilal Nehru,
Yes.
the patriarch of the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty.
Yeah, that was amazing.
This is an amazing find in an archive in Bombay. He assembled a troupe of 60 jugglers, musicians, acrobats, and so on for the Paris exposition of 1900. 50 million people went through the turnstiles in Paris, most of them making a beeline for Motilal's snake charmers and sleight of hand artists. 50 million people, it's like something like a quarter or a fifth of the entire population of England and Europe. So you can imagine, Motilal, he was a barrister in Allahabad at the time, of course, but he recognized that there was money to be made from sending these people overseas, and he did. And who knows, the whole history of the subcontinent might have been very different had he,
Stuck to this. Yeah.
stuck to this.
Well, the BJP would say that. Yeah.
And urged his son Jawaharlal to follow in his footsteps. But then there was, so of course by then, we're talking millions of people would have witnessed these feats of Indian magic firsthand. So obviously Western magicians, thought that, hey, this is a brand that we need to kind of appropriate. Yeah. And so they dressed up as Indian magicians and did it. But the interesting thing that I found was that at the same time you had Indians, so westernized Indians who could speak English and who could afford to buy a instruction book about how to do magic tricks. Some of them were amateurs, of course, some of them did it as a hobby, but some of them became quite professional. But what they did was that they would ditch their turbans and their sherwanis and put on top hats and tuxedos, and they would go to the West, those who were good enough, and encounter these Western magicians dressed up like Indians. and this actually happened. And that's what fascinated me. It is fascinating. Yeah.
So there are lots of larger-than-life characters in your book, and P.C. Sarkar, the great Indian Bengali magician who called himself the best in the world. And what comes across is also the amount of showmanship and self-publicity and rivalry. So that's another very interesting dimension. These guys were wizards at marketing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Has anybody here heard of P.C. Sarkar?
It's not a very magical crowd,
it's not a very, okay. There was P.C. Sarkar. There was another magician called Gogia Pasha as well. Can we have the next slide? Sorry.
The magic has put him to sleep.
Magic has put him to sleep. Okay, so these were the two. Back. So you got Gogia Pasha, born in Multan. Somebody told me today that there's posters in Karachi for a magician called Gogia Pasha who will, restore your flickering love and all this sort of stuff. He's more like so he's appropriated the name, which is interesting. I think he does magic as more like palmistry and astrology and things like that. But anyway, P.C. Sarkar, who was his chief rival, but he was an incredible guy, born in what is now Bangladesh, and really took Indian magic to a new height. He was famous for his publicity material, his posters, and like the one you see there, very much over the top. And he called himself the world's greatest magician, even before he'd left Bengal, much to the chagrin of Western magicians who said you've got no right to do that. But he was a master publicist, and I think he probably earned the title of India's greatest magician by the end of his life. But he died in the early 70s and was again travelled around the world multiple times, 30 tons of equipment. You know, his magic shows were like Bollywood spectacles, complete with, you know, rocket ships and planes and, you know, big cartons, and people would disappear, reappear, you know, fly in the air, the whole sort of thing. It was like a Bollywood spectacle.
Wow. So, pardon my this last question, but deep down in your cynical heart, do you think there is magic? Because you've deconstructed a lot, you haven't quite given the things away, but you know, one would like to believe that there is something out there which is still not amenable to a scientific explanation, or at least it hasn't been deciphered as yet. But you are perhaps the best person to comment on that.
Well, that's what magicians rely on. They rely on that hope in all of us that there is something inexplicable out there, except for, you know, maybe some of the more cynical people around. I'm sure none of them are in this audience. I wouldn't be here if they if they were. But magicians exploit this, and if they're good enough, they'll convince you that yes, there is something beyond the rational. Myself, having seen many, you know, of course, I met many magicians when I was in India, and not only in India, in other countries as well, doing traditional magic, doing modern magic, and have seen many tricks that I cannot explain. Okay. But they assure me, and I am also assured, that it is trickery, even though I just, for the life of me, cannot explain. Right. I mean, one of Sorkar's great tricks, and was this was in the days before Apple watches. He would say to people, "You've got to come here at 4:45 for the start of the session." They'd all sit down, and he would turn up half an hour later, and the audience would be really grumpy, and they'd say, "But you've come half an hour late." And he said, "No, check your watches," and it was 4:45. Wow. Now, I've had that done to me with my old wind-up analog watch by a magician in Delhi, without touching it, changing the time. I've seen magicians make things appear, disappear, like literally nothing up their sleeves. But it's tricky. Don't ask me how it's done, and I don't, as I said in the book, try and explain how it's done. I just really present things as they are and let people make up their own minds.
Great. Let's take some questions. I can't see anyone, so no. I can see this gentleman. Yes.
In the green.
In the green, yes.
Yeah, in the front row.
Yeah. If you could.
Yeah.
There's it's coming, I think. Here.
Hello, hi. So yeah, thank you for this great presentation. It was fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book. So one question that came to my mind is that, is there any continuation of this tradition in Pakistan, of this Indian magical tradition?
Look, that's a really good question, and maybe there's someone here who can enlighten me. I mean, I must admit I didn't come to Pakistan to do my research, because the archival material was mostly in India, in London, and even in America. And I do mention in the book, magicians who, were born in what is now Pakistan, like Gogi Pasha there. But look, snake charmers, I think you'll see here. But jugglers doing sort of more feats of dexterity rather than sleight of hand necessarily. That's at least the anecdotal evidence that I've gathered from my time in Pakistan. But in India, even in India, traditional street magic is not as alive and well as it used to be, as with all forms of that sort of folk popular entertainment. Street performers in most of these countries just finding it harder and harder to make ends meet, so they're dropping out of the profession. So I don't know if yeah.
We have to introduce you to Amir Liaquat Hussain one of these days.
So my question is that, according to all the research that you've done, it seems as if most of the sources are state-based, or archives that have been collected by the British, or for example the Mughal Empire, right?
Yep.
So did you find any sources from the locals, and if so, how did they differentiate between state narratives and what the people themselves had to say?
Yeah, look. I mean, the magicians themselves left nothing, because most of these street magicians were illiterate. They came from lower castes, whether they were Muslims or Hindus. They came from the lower rungs of society. Many of them were members of nomadic tribes. They were peripatetic tribes that would go from one place to another. So it's only, if somebody had sat down and collected their oral history, that would have been great. But and you do find fragments of that history in various places. So yes, it's like I can give you one example. There's a book called Bombay Beggars and Criers. A copy of, I think the only copy is in the British Library. It describes all the street life in Bombay in the 1890s. And there's something, there's maybe 80 or 90 different groups that he describes, and a lot of them do, if not magic or jugglery or acrobatics or other forms of sort of, I mean, magic. When I talk about street magic, I'm talking about everything from snake charmers to sword swallowers to maybe even tightrope walkers. Because a lot of these troupes, a troupe of magicians might be a dozen people, and they do different things. So some of them will do purely acts of physical dexterity. Others would do more sleight of hand. So it's a very broad term. But he describes in great detail all the various means that they use. So he describes them as beggars, but they weren't just standing there with their arms out. They were actually doing something in order to attract the attention of passers-by, in order to extract alms from them. So that's a good source, and there are other sources like that. So and then there are yes, in the archives. I mean, a lot of information about these about these magicians who were recruited for these world fairs and exhibitions, because, as I said, a lot of them ended up on the streets of London and other cities in Europe and had to be repatriated back home because they were just basically left to fend for themselves. And there in those archives you find descriptions of how they were recruited, what groups they came from. It's interesting, I mean, you think of these people as being, they come to England and they're left to fend for themselves, and but some of them actually, their cause was taken up by locals in England. Some of them were Indians, and some of them actually said, you've got to come to court. So that there was a case even in Australia where magicians, a troupe of magicians, actually marched down the main street of Melbourne in 1889, stopping traffic along the way. It was the first Indian mutiny in Australia, was done by a troupe of jugglers, because they'd been abandoned, and they went straight to the city court and demanded a passage home, the money that they were owed by their shonky, dodgy contractor impresario who'd brought them out here, who'd sort of gone and disappeared. They demanded their rights at the city court, and then the magistrate said, come back in a week and see what we can do. They came back in a week and they did it again. They marched down the main street of Melbourne, stopped the traffic, refused to leave the premises of the court. Most of them were then arrested, but at that point the government stepped in and said, look, this is crazy, we've got to get these people home, which is what they did. But they actually had the support of the local Indian community in England then. So, you can build up, again, from reading those newspaper reports or reading official documents in the India Office archives or in National Archives in Delhi, you can find out quite a lot about who these people were, where they came from, the motivations for being recruited overseas, the whole recruitment networks and all of this. So it's a, when I started researching, I never thought that I'd come across all this material, and it was there, and it was fascinating and hadn't really ever been looked at. So it was, I thought, very, worthwhile and valuable. There's two people. Maybe we'll take one from the back, and then we'll come back down to you, sir.
Okay, I'm Dr. Shahid Rashid. It was a very enlightening discussion. What I have observed that you have come to a rational conclusion about magic and all these things. My question is that what is your opinion and observation that how these magical beliefs have affected the mental health of people in India and Pakistan in this region.
Have affected the mental health.
Yeah,
Yeah.
magical beliefs. These magical beliefs.
Magical beliefs, yeah. I mean, people, who think that they're possessed by jinns or spirits or so on. I mean, there's a magical quality to that belief in the possession, and people will take. And a family member would take, a member of the family who thinks that they're possessed by a jinn or by a spirit to a witch doctor, an oja, that's what they call them in India, who will, actually often use sleight of hand rather than any sort of black magic. He will use actually white magic to try and get them out of this trance state. But I mean, look, it's in India, and I don't really touch on it in the book, but women are still killed in the belief that they're witches. People they're accused of being witches, and they're killed for that. Some states have introduced legislation specifically to try and stop that from happening. Maybe I haven't answered your question specifically. Effect on mental health is...
Are you talking about mental health of the two nations in general, or are you talking about specific episodes? Because exorcism and things like that, of course, you find in other...
Yeah, you find everywhere. Yeah, it's not specific, yeah. Anyway, there was a question in the middle, and then we'll come down. Yeah, there's a lady right in the center there. Is there a microphone going to the lady
it's
there?
going all the way.
Oh, it's going away, going around. So if I was a magician, I could make the microphone fly through the air.
That's the least you can do.
The least I can do, I know.
Work on that aspect.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. So we do know that the British rule in the subcontinent was that of exploitation. Do you think it has translated into this whole trickery and illusionism? Because from what I've heard is that the Indians were the ones who came up with all this jugglery and trickery and all of that, and that transferred to the West.
Yeah.
Now, they were not the ones who actually got economically, benefited by the whole thing, but we do see Western illusionists and stuff, and that transpired into kind of a business and entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
So you think some kind of the story of exploitation lies in this whole thing as well when you went through all those archives and stuff?
Oh yeah, there was a lot of exploitation happening. It was, it was also magicians became sort of part of the imperial project, if you like, because Western magicians I'm talking about, because the primitiveness, I guess I'm using quote marks there, of the Indian subject, of the colonial subject, was based on their supposed belief in superstition. They were seen as being superstitious, gullible, believing in magic and things like that. And so Western magicians went to India specifically to debunk Indian magic. So they would travel around, they would observe local magicians, learn their secrets, or basically pay them some bakshish in order to reveal their secrets to them. And then they would go back to the West, and they would sometimes publish or write an article in a newspaper explaining how these tricks were done, saying, this Indian magic is actually, it's old-fashioned, it's static, all these stories about how amazing Indian magicians are and what they can do it's all in the imagination. And so there was the book is very much about East meets West, but it's also East versus West. And Western magicians were really part of this. They wanted to emasculate their opponents, these Indian magicians, by revealing their secrets. But then again, they also appropriated a lot of these tricks and used them in their shows because they recognized the power of this image that people still had in the West of India as being a place, this mystical place. So it was in their interests to present that on stage, but at the same time they, did their best to debunk, the very secrets, the very magic that they were presenting. So it was it's like the dubious sort of dichotomy at work there, and that's one thing that I explore a lot of in the book.
So I meant to ask, I mean, some of the other sort of aspects of the so-called mystical East or spiritual East, like, you know, the Guru Rajneeshs of the world and the yoga and a lot of other things, those are still fairly hip and sort of popular and all that. But after somebody like Sarkar, I mean, the kind of height which he achieved in terms of his profession, that seems to be on the wane, right? So in India, there's no real successor. There is a son, but...
There's a son, yeah. There's probably about a dozen Indian magicians who still, you know, do big stage shows and travel around the country. But yeah, look, it's mentalism is very big in India. It's probably the most popular form of magic at the moment. And then you have, you know, guys doing corporate shows like you do in the West. A lot of magicians just sort of rely on that sort of stuff. Good street magicians are harder and harder to find. Yeah, look, it's waning, but you know, I guess you can say it's waning in the West as well. But you still do have, you know, some greats like David Copperfield David Blaine and Darren Brown and others who are, you know, pretty amazing at their work. And in a way, I mean, you know, people think that you know, these days with you know, CGI and special effects and all these sorts of things, that, you know, what's left, you know, what is left, you know, that is magical, that, you know, can't be replicated on the screen or on your laptop or, you know, through YouTube. But I think that magicians are actually just getting smarter and better at what they do, and you know, particularly when you see close-up magic, you know, which absolutely cannot rely on, you know, props and mirrors and smokes and trapdoors and, you know, hidden wires and things like that. You know, and they're actually, you know, kind of keeping one step ahead of you know, that sort of technology that's there.
So we probably have time only for one more question, if there is one. There's a question there.
Yeah, a question down the front. This gentleman's been asking for a while. Yeah.
And then there's somebody in the back.
Doesn't seem like an appropriate question. First, I would like to really, I'm grateful for you to be sharing your information after gathering everything.
Sorry.
Extremely grateful for that. There are a couple of things that I want to myself know about so that I get cleared about it. And it kind of does bother me, or intrigues me would be the right word. Number one, what are you, I mean, we're talking about jinns in the subcontinent. But when we go back in history, we can take the name, or are we allowed to take the name of Solomon as the master, as the king of jinns?
Yeah.
And all his powers. So I would, you know, briefly, if you could explain what that context was, and if it's just a myth, or if it's that real, you know, if it's real, something like that, whatever you share about that. And the other thing, I would actually want to talk about the mental health concept. I'll give you an example of that. In the subcontinent, we have a name for this. And in this new age world, let's say if this is not Pakistan or India or any local localities, if maybe it's an European place or America or Canada, and people are feeling this paradigm shift, for instance, they're feeling energies around them.
Yeah.
And they have different names like druids and demons or angels, whatever they want to call them. You know, so they're not familiar with the concept that there is a being called, our religion teaches that, so it's easier for us to believe. But perhaps in their religion, they don't even have a name, and some people don't even believe religion because they're atheists or whatever. They've formed other ways of finding solace between sense and the unseen.
Yeah.
But a lot of times they get troubled, and I mean, I've read experience. I haven't met many people, but on the internet, I've read a lot of experiences, people locking themselves up in their rooms, or people hearing these sounds and all that, right?
Yeah.
But they don't have a reason behind it, so they conjure stories. What do you think about that, and what do you think about Solomon being, you know, in the past, was that a legend or a myth? And now how is that impacting this new age world where people don't know much about
that's
jinns?
a very broad question. Solomon is king of the jinns. Well, that's, I think...
Is he?
Well, I think it's written, isn't it? And
What would you say about that? I'm not sure.
well, I mean, you know, this is...
It's
whether
personal
you,
belief.
whether you...
It's a personal belief thing.
It's a
right?
personal
So you
belief
have to
thing,
be-
yeah. Yeah, but yeah, look, I mean, the whole mental aspect of it is, well, it's a very big question, really. But it's
You want a
obviously...
shorter question? That gent also had it, and then maybe you can
Okay,
combine the
yeah.
two. And that will be the last one.
Okay.
So it is a shorter question, I think. So just following on the question that this woman was asking back here about kind of exploitation and appropriation, you mentioned just at the very end there people like David Copperfield, David Blaine, Darren Brown. I would say, I think in the West, magic is kind of, or kind of performative magic is rising in popularity again in the States. You have somebody like Shin Lim winning America's Got Talent,
Exactly.
winning again. So I guess the question is, what debt, I mean, you know, you're talking about in the rest of this talk up to the 1930s or so, but what debt do people like David Blaine and Darren Brown and Shin Lim owe to, you know, this kind of magic? Like how much of it really did just come out of India into the West and then maybe resurface?
Yeah, look, that's a good question. I'd say that almost all of this magic, it's a long, I've actually written, my thesis is kind of more, the PhD thesis that I did as part of this book is more on that. One theory, look, about 60, 70, maybe 80% of all conjuring tricks that we see today would derive from the East. And when you think of magic tricks, I mean, there are certain, and there are 4 or 5 different types of magic. You know, you can make an object appear, disappear. You can make something, you know, change from one form to another. You can make something levitate. You can pass through. There are certain. There's about 6 or 7 sort of broadly defined categories of magic, and then it's just people being innovative, people coming up with new ways of doing those core magic tricks. And of all those core magic tricks, you will find in, not only in the East, but and by East I mean not just India, but also the Far East, so China and countries like that, and Japan. So somebody's actually said in about 1930, was a guy called Ross Dennison who was at SOAS. He actually started SOAS. He said the only magic tricks that weren't derived from the East were card tricks. Okay, card magic. And when you think about it, cards did originate in China, I think in about the 10th century, but card magic is something that was only taken up in about the 18th, 19th century, and then very quickly appropriated by Indians. Indians started doing card magic as well. So all other magic you can find the provenance in the East, basically was his argument. And he was also a president of the London Magic Society as well. So he was a magician. So he was not only a linguist who could speak 49 languages and, you know, set up SOAS and so on, but he was also a magician. So he kind of knew what he was talking about. But yes, it's you know, so even, yeah, David Blaine, David Copperfield, all these people, I guess, owe their, you know, their performances to you know, the magic of the East. Yeah.
Great. John, thank you for sharing your magic with us.
Thank you. Thanks, Osama.
Thank you to all of you.